Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining our session today on AI, ChatGPT, large language models, and how it's going to impact the future of healthcare. My name is Adam Landman. I am the Chief Information Officer at Mass General Brigham, and I'm pleased to start off this session. Just going to spend a minute and just give everybody a little bit of background, and it's your chance to figure out if you're in the right session or you want to find one of the other interesting sessions. And then we'll get started and introduce the panel and start what I think will be a lively discussion. So first, I think this is one of the most exciting times in healthcare, and maybe even more broadly, and that's because AI is really starting to have an impact in our everyday lives. Think about self-driving cars. The company Waymo has driven over 60 million miles autonomously. That's simply with AI, without human intervention. Think about how computer vision is starting to have an impact in our lives. On your phone, you're using computer vision every day when your smartphones are identifying people in your photos that you're taking. Or if you're on social media and it's suggesting the persons that are in the photos. And then there's large language models. And we're starting to see large language models that can write poetry, that can write essays, and answer our common questions. And so today's session is all going to be about generative AI. And that's a specific type of AI where the algorithms actually generate net new content. It's still based on training data sets, and in fact, large training data sets, but it can generate this with just a little bit of information that you provide. And so we're starting to see that generative AI is really good at summarizing content. For instance, you can ask it to summarize a long research study for you. It's also got incredible capabilities around creating content, like images. There are algorithms like DALL-E that can turn people like me who have no artistic skills into a true artist by generating really incredible imagery. We're also seeing that these large language models can even program code. You can ask it to write code in common languages like Python or C, and it'll execute and it'll generate the code that you need to program the computer. And so we're going to zoom in this session in large language models, which are a type of generative AI. And the idea behind large language models is that they're trained on large data sets. And just to give you a sense, GPT 3.5 was trained on 45 terabytes of data. That's almost all of the known open data that's available. And they used over 175 billion parameters in their model. If you think about a typical model that you're going to use, or that many of you are maybe researchers, you might use 20 or 30 parameters. This is over 175 billion parameters. And then, of course, those algorithms went through human review and refinement. And how those algorithms now work is that they are essentially predicting the next word in a series of words, and then that goes on to predict the sentences, and then the next sentence after that. And you may all have seen that one of the other magic layers here is that they've put a chat interface on top of the large language model. And what that chat interface allows all of us to be able to interact with this model, ask it questions, receive the answer, and then you can even have follow-up questions or ask for refinement. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, are large language models, generative AI, and particularly with a focus on how they impact healthcare. And we've got an incredible panel assembled today, which we'll do quick introductions right now. Brian, do you want to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Adam. So my name is Brian Anderson. I'm MITRE's Chief Digital Health Physician, which means I have the pleasure of leading a number of MITRE's strategic initiatives in digital health. So MITRE, if you haven't heard of us, we are a not-for-profit. We run the federal government's Research and Development Center for Health, which enables us to really partner with the federal government in unique ways. So some of those ways include some of the work that I helped lead in the Cancer Moonshot alongside Dr. Bertinoli and the NIH team in the White House, as well as clinical trial readiness, redesign coming out of the pandemic, all the things that we've learned, the painful lessons coming out of that. And then notable and important to this is the work that we're partnering with the federal government around health AI assurance. So that concept of assurance essentially means, how do we assure that the AI that's being built and deployed is safe and effective? And so to that end, I'm one of the co-founders of the Coalition for Health AI, which we'll speak about in a little bit.
Great, welcome Brian, thank you for joining. Ruth.
I'm Ruth Carlos. I'm a radiologist at the University of Michigan. I wear several hats. I'm the chair of the Academy for Radiology and Biomedical Imaging Research, a coalition of radiology departments and organizations advancing imaging research. I also am a clinician scientist working in the health equity space and are beginning to use these generative models to try to address some of these intractable issues.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Munjal.
Good morning. I'm Munjal Shah. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hippocratic AI. We are building a large language model that's safety focused. And our main goal with this is to, focus on healthcare, not as much medicine, meaning we don't believe these large language models really are ready to do diagnoses. But we do believe that they can have a very large impact on all the other things that we have going on in healthcare. And so I'm a serial entrepreneur. This is actually my fourth company. I built an AI company before and did a lot of my prior research in AI. But really, I spent the last 10 years building a healthcare company and decided that really with the advent of ChatGPT that kind of AI finally works. Like, it finally works good enough for us to do something really amazing, and it's time to try to do that.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. And Varun.
Thank you. I'm Varun. I'm the president and founder of MoveWorks. We build an AI co-pilot for your employees. If you think about the mundane issues that your employees run into regularly at large organizations, like help with passwords, getting access to applications, VPN troubleshooting instructions, or how to generate employment verification letters, or book paid time off and things along those lines. Typically, employees have to interact with service desks that can take a few days or a few hours to resolve their issues, makes the business very inefficient. So we've been deploying large language models now for about 7 years or so, way before it became cool. Our applications use about 200 different large language models in the background. And we serve about 4 million employees globally now, over 100 countries, 100 plus languages. Mass General and MITRE use our applications, including organizations like Unilever, Salesforce, Siemens, Honeywell, et cetera. So super excited to be here because I think this large language model revolution, so to speak, has been underway for about 7 years or so, or 8 years or so now since transformer architectures were invented. But now with ChatGPT, it's at the forefront and a worthy discussion.
Great, thanks for joining, Varun. Now that everybody's heard a little bit about the panelists, we'd love to ask you a question just to get a little bit of sense of our audience. And so I'll ask for you to, I'll first share the question, then I'm going to ask for a show of hands. The question's going to be about how often do you use large language models? And here are the options. You're using it multiple times a day, 1 time per day, once a week, once a month, or you've never used an LLM. What I'd ask is, as I repeat the choices, if we could just get a show of hands, that would be great. So for everybody in the room, who is using large language models? And these are things like ChatGPT, Google Bard, MedPalm. Those are some examples of large language models. Who's using it multiple times per day? Pretty good. I would say less than 10%. 5 to 10% multiple times per day. How about 1 time per day? About the same. Once a week, a little bit more, maybe more like 10 to 15%. Once a month, okay, maybe more like 10 to 15%. And how about never used an LLM? All right, so some people are not voting, clearly. That's okay. But we wanted to just get a sense of how often this is being used in practice, and also how much experience all of you have with these technologies. So thank you for sharing that. And I think that's pretty representative, probably, of most people generally. Why don't we start off and just get a sense for, there's a lot of promise of large language models. And maybe I could just have each of you kind of share some of your thoughts on what are some of the opportunities that exist for large language models in healthcare. Maybe we'll kind of go around.
Yeah, so some of the more exciting things that I'm interested in seeing with large language models, particularly with clinical workflow, is note summarization. I think when we think about reducing the burden on clinicians, on staff, where you have a patient coming in from a referring center that, there's a 400-page note packet that goes in with that. The provider, the nurse, the MA all have to be able to digest that. And so a large language model being able to summarize that, I think, is one really potent use case for providers and just health systems to take advantage of. The next one that I'm excited about is inbox management. So as a physician, I understand and appreciate the pain that many providers have in the ever-increasing number of messages that you have to reply to, be it from a patient's family, a caregiver. LLMs, if you've seen some of the evidence out there, show that they're more empathetic and they're more detailed in the responses. So the value of LLMs partnered with humans, I think, is of great value for those two.
Thanks, Brian. Go ahead, Ruth.
I work in the research space and in care delivery. So the groups that we're partnering with are taking the notes that clinicians generate, and we're using large language models to see if we can extract information about health-related social needs, and then to be able to immediately provide those needs, address those needs within the context of the same clinical visit. But it also has the power to capture tone. We hear a lot about implicit bias, but there is a way, we believe, to capture the tonality within that encounter in order to understand some of the challenges that patients face whenever they come to an institution. The second potential is automated generation of avatars that are race and gender concordant in order to facilitate things like informed consent processes for research projects, or even to deliver some of the distributed care that we're trying to deliver outside the context of an institution.
Thank you for sharing. Munjal.
Yeah, so let me paint a picture. Take your language model, add voice recognition on one side, on the other side add voice synthesis, and turn it into a voice conversational agent. We believe that this will open the door for really what we call super staffing. So we've all talked about language models in the application, kind of let's talk about it in the back office. For revenue cycle management, people have talked about language models for also helping physicians, which is great. There's a whole bunch of applications of that. But I want to have you think about a different use case, which is, let's take something like a clinical care nurse. Today, a chronic care nurse, sorry. In a chronic care nurse today, we only really provide those to the top 1-2% of our patients, because we don't want to say it this way, but we really can't afford at $90 an hour to provide it to every single person who has a chronic disease. But what would happen if we did? Like, how might that change healthcare? How might that level of attention make an impact? So one of the things that we're exploring is, and many of those, there's not a diagnosis involved in a chronic care nurse calling up. It's mostly following up to get you to take your meds and get your refill and check in and see how you're doing on that new medication you just went on. And so we said, what if you had an infinite supply of chronic care nurses? Like, how would that change healthcare? How would that change how we follow up? And how would that change our outcomes and our costs? And so that's the direction that we're looking at, is really, we call it super staffing. It's not about how do you save some money and lower your nursing costs. Like, we don't have enough nurses as it is, and we need more of them. It's not even how do we close the nursing gap that we have. It's how do we make it not where we have 3 million nurses in the country, but we have 30 million or 300 million. And how do we think about how that might change healthcare?
Thanks, Munjal.
Fantastic question. I think there's generally, when you think about technology, conceptually we think about it in 3 dimensions, and all of them apply to large language models as well. One is what Munjal talked about, which is creating surplus. If you think about technologies that came before, like Google or even ATMs for banks, they created a lot of access, and you can expect that with large language models with the examples you're giving. Second one is making everyone more productive. Think about the amount of time that gets wasted on mundane tasks where experts are not being leveraged for what they're best at. They're actually doing mundane things. There's statistics out there about the amount of time doctors spend on inboxes or providers spend in appointment booking and things along those lines. That's the second dimension. The third dimension, I guess, is as important, is increasing the effectiveness of your baseline expert. Large language models can bring significant recall and significant amount of precision in terms of recommendations. Think about describing symptoms to it, and a model that has infinite capacity to recall very precisely prior cases and prior sort of patients who'd come with similar conditions, and what was the recommendations and outcomes in those cases, and improving the quality of every provider that's out there in terms of supporting patients. So rarely do technologies give you wins on all three spectrums, and large language models is a paradigm change that will create surplus, it'll create efficiency, and it'll improve the baseline effectiveness of every single provider that's out there.
Thanks, Varun, and thanks, everyone. And in fact, it's incredible the range of areas we just covered, right? From our clinicians, our care managers, our chronic care nurses, our researchers, our providers. Really, it sounds like everyone, there's potential for large language models to impact the entire healthcare workforce and almost everything we do in healthcare. But there's also challenges in getting there. And I'm hoping we can spend a few minutes discussing some of those challenges and also your ideas on how we can overcome some of those. The first, and I'd argue maybe the most important in healthcare, is safety. Because we're talking about human lives. The last thing we want to do is increase morbidity or mortality. And so, what can we do as we start to pilot, study, and eventually implement large language models? How can we do that in a way to ensure that they're safe for our patients? And Brian, maybe I'll start with you and some of the great work that you're doing with Chai.
Thanks, Adam. That's an important question. So a year and a half ago, a number of us in the health space, so a number of academic institutions, some leadership from Microsoft and Google, and a few startups came together and asked a basic question. Are there a set of best practices or standards for safe and effective AI development and implementation? A very brief environmental survey showed that there was, depending on how you count it, between 100 and 200 self-espoused best practices. So suffice to say, there was not a consensus set of best practices. And time again, what we've seen in health and other industries is at the nascent level of a new technology, of a disruptive space like LLMs, if industry can come together and establish what those standards are for safe and effective development, that you have a much better chance of creating a synergistic relationship between the regulatory bodies and the industry and its development and facilitating that kind of innovation space. And so that's really what we wanted to do in Chai, is how do we create these set of best practices with two North Stars, really, trustworthy AI and transparent process. And so with those as our North Stars in Chai, we developed this coalition. It's now over 150 different organizations. Hippocratic AI is one, University of Michigan, MoveWorks. I mean, everybody up here is part of it. The work that we're doing in AI assurance, though, is foundational to this whole conversation around large language models. So much of the regulatory framework on the federal side with FDA and ONC and others is around predictive models or analytical models and the expert systems that, as a clinician, we're very familiar with. LLMs and generative models, that's new territory. And so when we think about, from an industry perspective, what those best practices are and how we can validate independently a generative large language model, if it's assured, if it's safe, if it's aligned to the values that we as clinicians want for our patients, if anyone is honest with you, they'll tell you we don't know exactly how to get there yet, but what we're trying to do in Chai is coming together in a consensus-driven process that brings together industry members and leadership from the FDA, ONC, NIH, the White House, all together in one coalition to try to get to an answer that informs both the industry standard, so when Microsoft and Google go out and develop their IP, and then also on the federal side, when the FDA or ONC are making their regulatory decisions, that we're all using the same playbook. What is trustworthy, what is transparently developed generative models?
Great, thanks Brian for sharing that and for your leadership. Clearly this is emerging and something that will be incredibly valuable. How are others thinking about safety and effectiveness?
We've just drawn a line in the sand, and we've just said, we don't think you should use this for diagnoses, and we're not even going to let you. When you use our model, if you try to make it do it, it'll be like, sorry, I'm not going to answer that question. And we think that's kind of the stance that we'll take for a while until we're really convinced that it's safe enough. And so, when you look at healthcare broadly, we don't really have a diagnosis problem, meaning, we don't diagnose well. What we really have with most of the disease burden in the country, if you look at it from a population health perspective, is people not doing the things they should be doing after they're diagnosed. And so that's why, we realize there's enough low-hanging fruit there. Let's go do that. Let's leave diagnoses aside. I still think there's a place for doctors, and there's a certain special role they play in that diagnosis process. And honestly, we've chosen a very, in some ways, conservative stance around diagnoses of just saying we're just not going to do it, and we're not going to let people do it with our LLM.
I'll add a bit more color. One is, I think, is the choice of applications. I think it's super important whenever you're coming across new technology to start with the mundane. Start with things that inherently have low risk. And I think that's something that everyone will have to prioritize and look at their own use cases and look at their own examples. For example, in the healthcare world, of course, the mundane of just making your employees more productive with regular things so they have more time to focus on things that matter is a great use case to get started, and maybe with not a lot of safety implications there. But as you start getting into more patient-facing and outward-facing use cases, I think there's two dimensions to it. One is, of course, the clause that Munjal pointed out, which is there's some things that you should steer pretty clear off because you don't want to do those altogether. And that is sort of, you can almost call that a policy model that gets layered on top of your application that says, thou shalt not do this. The second one is what you're pointing out, where things start to get more sophisticated, which is an alignment problem. At the end of the day, when you think about large language model-based applications, a lot of what they're doing is there's a foundation model in place that's trying to be as truthful as possible to the underlying data set. But beyond that, the application gets imparted certain behaviors. And that happens through a process called reinforcement learning, where the model isn't learning anything new, but it's learning a new behavior. And that behavior happens through something called a reward model. And a reward model is trying to score the base model for maximum points, and the base model is seeking that reward. And that's where things like alignment come in. If you can come up with the right alignment principles to align these applications with certain behaviors that are acceptable to the whole community, right? This won't be something that one individual should decide. This shouldn't be something that a few leaders should decide. This is ultimately going to have an impact in the community, and it's something that the entire community should live with, and all the trade-offs that come with it. And I think that's where things start to get super interesting, and that should take time, right? That's not something that should happen overnight. So starting with use cases that are safe, that are sort of more mundane, having clear guidelines in terms of policy models of what these large language model applications should not do, and then starting a debate at community level to outline a set of alignment principles, which every large language model provider should adhere to at the end of the day. Just like making airplanes safe was a mandate for world travel. And today we take airplane safety as a given. It wasn't easy to make airplanes as safe as they are, but that was a prerequisite to deploying airplanes at scale, and that's how we should be thinking about alignment.
So what I hear is, what is the safety after we've developed it and we are now implementing it, releasing it into the world? But as everyone here has pointed out, the language models are predicated on a representative data set, and we know that there is systematic missingness in the data set. There are groups of individuals for whom the data set are missing. So perhaps part of safety is a disclosure on which patient populations or which groups of individuals were these models trained on, and are more applicable for those groups, and apply these to other groups at your own risk, sort of a white box warning. However, even as a challenge identified, I can see some of the work that each of you are doing to actually improve the quality of the underlying data sets by using some of the large language models to reach out into the community and facilitate recruitment of patients in order to populate large aspects of missing data.
If I
go
could,
ahead.
I mean, just really value and agree with what you just said, Ruth and Varun, you as well. I think one of the things that we're excited about in Chai is this concept of a national registry of models where it builds on a core set of metrics that you're kind of getting to, Varun, is how do we measure alignment with fairness and mitigating bias? Or what does the concept of monitoring look like for the performance of these models over time? And how can we share that transparently with society so that if I'm a patient and I'm going into a health system, one, I know what models, what large language models might be deployed at that health system that are going to be used on me. How were they trained? What were the types of data that were used to train them? Because if I'm a Native American and the only models that are being trained don't have any representation of that population, is that model fit for purpose? How accurate is it going to be in its performance on me? These are important questions I think we as a society need to come together around to understand what are those core metrics for alignment to get to that safe and effective and trustworthy AI.
I'll add one more aspect to exactly what you're talking about, which is how do you know this model applies well to the area that it's trying to make a judgment on or predictions on? And one of the hardest frontiers in language model development and the mystique around it is explainability. No one really knows what happens when these words get converted to vectors and transformers and you keep layering deeper networks on top of it. But perhaps that should be a prerequisite to deploying applications in certain areas, that explainability should get developed. And maybe these applications themselves will explain why they made a certain judgment, in which case anyone who's using that judgment will be able to explain, look, that's not, that explainability doesn't quite cut it, and therefore we won't use it in this particular application. So there's frontiers here that need to get developed that are still not there, that will take time, but I think are important.
Yeah, there's one last thing I wanted to add here, which is we keep thinking about safety as a set of principles and policies top down. And there is a bottoms up thing we probably should add in addition. So I still, we're working with these groups in Brian's group, but we're also going out and saying, hey, our language model will be shipped one role at a time. So we'll say our chronic care nurse is ready, we'll say our preoperative nurse is ready, we'll say our genetic counselor is ready, but we'll only say they're ready when we've had 1,000 genetic counselors use it and say it answers correctly, it answers the right way, it says it the right way. And these are people that have that certification, that we validated have that certification. And so I think, there's, who knows better whether something is ready than the people doing that job today in the profession, in the field. And so I think that there's a both and here of saying, we should have a set of principles for which we design it, but even before we launch it, we should have the practitioners today say, yep, it seems to be doing the right thing. And a majority of them, not just one or two, but a majority of the ones playing. So we're actually aiming for every single role to have 1,000 of these folks do a process called RLHF, where you're actually giving feedback to the model, which stands for reinforcement learning with human feedback. And then we're going one step further. Unless the majority of them actually say it's ready to ship, we're not going to ship it.
So you're all outlining the important work that we have to do, and I think getting at how do we make sure that these algorithms will be as equitable as possible so that we can use them for all patients and that they will hopefully have the same impact and characteristics. Is there anything else we can do now? Given this field is so new, can we take a different approach to be more equitable from the get-go?
I'll say one. I think it'll be very useful to start establishing baseline data sets and certain outcomes related to those baseline data sets, because that start to create a foundation of evaluation for any application that comes underway. And I think that's what Munjal is sort of alluding to, which is you need a representation of underlying data sets. And that work is super essential. You can't leave that alone to providers to come up with their own data sets. I think as someone who's going to deploy these applications, evaluate these applications, having your own data sets on which these models should get tested. And there's a lot that goes into building these data sets, and it can take a lot of time to build these data sets. I think that would be a good area to start, where you don't need expertise in large language models yourself. You just need to establish a pretty clear baseline of performance you expect from these language models.
There also has to be socialization of the end user. There's a randomized control trial that showed that false AI information fed to a poor clinician led the clinician to accept false AI information, whereas a better clinician would have questioned the AI information. So as we navigate this space, we need to become informed consumers of each of these AI models, and to maintain a healthy degree of skepticism so that we don't relinquish our responsibility to act as goodness experts or goodness guarantors in a way that, for example, you still want the clinician to act within a clinical encounter.
For me, two comments to that, Adam. The first one, so whenever I'm up on a panel like this, I like to remind people all algorithms or models, be it generative or predictive, are programs that are trained on our histories. Think about that. Algorithms are just programs trained on our histories, right? And so I think, Varun, to your point, one of the, I think, critical steps that we as a society need to take is ensuring that the future generative models are trained on data sets that are more representative of people that are traditionally unreached, underserved, be it in, I do a lot of work in clinical research trials, so there are whole populations that are just underrepresented. How can we, as we think about a more equitable future in AI, intentionally work with those communities to do the data labeling, the hard work that we need to do to create those data sets to make them available for the future models to be trained on. And I think the second thing is, I love Microsoft, I love Google, but there's this need to ensure that we're democratizing AI research so that we're empowering, the startups and other organizations that want to empower the researchers from local communities that aren't at these, very large, well-funded and endowed corporations to do that kind of research. Again, there are examples where if you're enabling the kinds of researchers to go out into the communities, to partner with the communities, to get the data available and to build the models that are relevant to those communities, you're creating a much more equitable situation for society.
Yeah.
Right.
On the topic of data sets, I think there's two things to think about. One is, I guess, more important than the other, which is having evaluation data sets as people who is deploying applications is really important, because ultimately you're the gatekeeper of what gets deployed inside your environments. And those eval data sets are not that crazy to create. And then there's training data sets, which is where you might need to start fostering an initiative where all language models have access to certain underlying training data sets to train models. But if you can safeguard deployment of these models through better eval data sets, that's super powerful. And I think to your second point, the open source movement, especially as championed recently in the last 3 months by Meta and their FAIR lab, they've open sourced a lot of large language models. Now, they're not for commercial
Not always by choice.
Sometimes accidentally or through leaks.
Sometimes some rogue employee open sourced it for them, but yeah.
It was because the weights got released.
That's right,
But
yeah.
they were planning to open source the model anyway. The
Right,
leak was with the
right.
weights of the
Yeah.
model. But without getting into too much geekdom, I think it's important to understand that the open source movement is going to be extremely important in empowering everyone to build large language models with the right data sets.
Yeah, we've actually built a new bias testing framework that we used on our model and we'll be releasing for others to use. Because we've invested a whole bunch of time and energy trying to build that and invest in it and use it as a testing framework. And we tested it against us and GPT-4 and 3 other language models as well. And anyways, we thought, this will benefit everybody. We should release it. So we're just prepping it now so it can be released properly.
And clearly using open source tools and building on existing discoveries is one way this field is moving so quickly. Mm-hmm. In medicine, we're evidence-based, and one of the ways we're evidence-based is we rely on publication and peer-reviewed publication. And so, Ruth, as a journal editor at one of the major journals in our country, the Journal of the American College of Radiology, I'm wondering how you're starting to think about whether you'll have standards for when generative AI is used in the research methods, and/or it might even be used to actually write the paper. How are you beginning to think about those issues?
It's a great question, and it's something that editors in general have been grappling with. In August, about 30 radiology editors from across the spectrum, radiology, JCR, radiology, AI, will be getting together to develop a consensus statement of best practices for authors, reviewers, and for publication. As with topics that have been brought up here, including transparency, explainability, transparency of the information that's published is really the way we disseminate, and how do we highlight which has been generated by AI and unfiltered by the author, and which parts of the methodology have relied on either proprietary AI or open source AI that is more or less reproducible. A lot of the safety issues, underlying data issues, foundational issues, bias testing issues, those are all things that bear consideration as we develop these consensus standards.
Great. And are there tools, kind of alluded to some of them, but are there tools that will get developed to assist with this? For instance, being able to show when generative AI tools were being used. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's work underway to somehow watermark output of these large language models, because at the end of the day, they're assigning probabilities to tokens when they're making those predictions. And if you can encrypt those tokens and then give people a set of tools to understand if a certain chain of tokens has such a unique probability that it likely came from a large language model, or highly likely it came from a large language model, that can be used to figure things out. The other aspect of not just large language models, but in general, AI being used for invention. Right? You have AlphaFold from Google Brain that's great at protein folding, and I worked in a protein folding lab for some time, and it was considered this insane craft to figure out the right shape of a protein molecule. But now you have AlphaFold that's quite capable of figuring out optimum shapes for certain proteins. How do you attribute that invention? Who does that attribution go to? What is the underlying body of work that facilitated it? The explainability of these models. These are all important frontiers because now we're talking about, in the area of research, entirely new inventions that are being made by machine learning systems.
We have to find a lot more evidence-based content to feed these machines. Like, you don't realize, like, most of them have very few what they call tokens, which are basically the words that they were pre-trained on, that are truly from healthcare. Like, I mean, if travel, every single token's on the internet because they want you to find their hotel. And so 100% of the world's travel tokens are in that common crawl, which they use typically to train this thing. But the number of healthcare tokens on there as a percentage is probably only 2% or 5%. And we really do want, you know, things like, you know, our standards of care to go on there. We really do want all of the really careful, not always evidence-based, but certainly experience-based documents that we follow when we do healthcare to be on there and to be pre-trained in the model. And somebody has to go and get that. I mean, we are doing that at Hippocratic AI because we just saw it missing. But I think that, you know, people don't realize how much of that information these models have never seen. You know, things like UpToDate have actually been shown. If you look, there's an interesting study that came out on PubMed GPT, which was where they trained it on PubMed and then tried to use it to make some clinical decisions. And what they found was it did worse than being trained on content that was more related to kind of operational documents that you would give to a physician. Because if you ever read a PubMed paper, I mean, what, you know, even when the R squared is like 0.98, they're like, well, maybe this indicates that perhaps in some cases this is true. And the problem is the language model reads all of those, I don't know what you want to call it, but, you know, special humility that is research papers. You know what I'm talking about. Like, they're all, I mean, the evidence can be so clear that A correlates to B, and they'll be like, well, I don't know, maybe. And so then the problem, it gets confused, and it's like, well, I don't know, maybe you have that. And so it's mimicking what it's reading. So we really, there's a lot of great healthcare content that we use to teach our physicians and use to teach all of our other medical professionals that we need to get into these models. And I don't think it's a little bit missing, I think it's a lot missing. And somebody needs to be spending time on that to build the right language model for healthcare and for medicine.
Yeah, I think when we talk about these tools for transparency and watermarking and the importance of that kind of transparency, one of the things that it's important to remember as health systems, as providers, is ultimately who's on the hook for what's generated. And if you look at some of the indications from the Federal Office for Civil Rights or the State Attorney General in California, there seems to be an implication that it's the provider. At the end of the day, even if that generated note back to your patient is watermarked and transparently generated by an LLM, if that provider is sending it, the person ultimately who's on the hook, if there's some potential bad outcome from that, is the health system or is the provider. Now, it's not written in stone yet, but I think, certainly for those in the audience, it bears, careful thinking about what the implications of that are when we think about transparently sharing with our patients where this content is coming from large language models.
There's a bit of an inspiration today. So Morgan Stanley deployed large language models to give financial advice. But what they did internally was every time a large language model gives financial advice, it generates a report for this advice that goes to the compliance team first. And they found that they just needed a much larger compliance team. And essentially financial advisors started becoming people who would read these recommendations and either approve it or disapprove it. So the role and the distribution of workforce in organizations will start to change, and maybe healthcare providers will need to think a lot more about compliance and inspectors of these recommendations as opposed to the ones coming up with recommendations. And that's something that could happen.
So I joke that physicians will always have a job because you need someone to sue. And now you're telling me, Varun, that my job, instead of talking to patients, is now looking at the things that's actually talking to patients.
Very abstracted.
Very abstracted. While I say that jokingly, I think that there are potentially unintended consequences for the implementation of these types of tools. So, Munjal, I love the fact that we can expand capacity of a critical resource like nurses. That has implications for the system at large, because as you have an expansion of nurses, they will be recommending supportive services, treatments, diagnostic tests. Can the system have excess capacity to actually meet those needs that are now generated because you've done the right thing? Because we are a system, one of the potentials to move it forward to a positive note, what I see is an AI of AIs. Wouldn't it be great if every person who attends a Patriots game has in their pocket a doctor relative, a platform that can translate into lay speech what their doctor is telling them, and then generate questions to help empower the patients to make better use of that care encounter, and then support the patient as they transition out of that encounter to get the other care that they need. There is so much potential, and I don't want the very real challenges to take away from that potential.
Can I jump in here on something?
Go ahead.
I'm super passionate about something you just said, which is this idea of bedside manner with a capital B. And this is one of the things that we're very focused on. But here's what I mean by capital B, bedside manner. It isn't just, is it empathetic when you talk, and is it more empathetic than a physician, which I guess that study showed that it was. And a lot of that though is a time. Physicians are not empathetic because they don't have time. In fact, the average study shows the number one correlation to bedside manner is will you let the patient finish their story, but the average emergency room physician cuts off the average patient within 20 seconds. Like, these are like actual studies, right? So one is like, do you have time? Well, language models have time. They have infinite time, actually, right? Second, when you take that further, speak every language. I know my mother would feel more comfortable speaking in Hindi about her problems because she's always trying to get an Indian doctor who she can speak to in Hindi, which in her case is not so hard. But but imagine other dialects where that is harder, and other languages where it's harder. I think the third element of it that we've seen is this: we keep complaining about patient engagement, right? We can't get patient engagement, can't get patient engagement. Well, that's because we don't engage them. Like, can you sit there and can your chronic care nurse spend 35 minutes chatting with a patient where the patient goes in and talks about how, oh, it was their injury and where did that happen? Oh, it was in Desert Storm and there I was in the foxhole. And they will want to share that if you let them. And what happens at the end of that? The language model can talk that because it's read all of Wikipedia, so it can probably talk about that scenario that happened. But at the end you go, hey sir, great, I just want to make sure you're going to go to rehab and you're going to take your meds. Like, the difference today is, hi, how are you? I'm calling from MGB. Want to make sure you're taking your meds. Okay, are you going to rehab? All right, thanks, bye. That's just another nag, right? It's not a relationship. And so we now have the time and energy and power to build relationships with them. We even don't have to give them a sheet of instructions on discharge and say, remember on day 4 to change your bandage or you might get an infection. Just call them on day 4 and say, change your bandage today. Your probability of it happening is much higher. And so we need to rethink our patient interactions if this technology comes to bear. And this is what I mean by bedside manner with a capital B. We can do things truly differently when we have kind of tremendous more capacity than we have today and tremendous more patients as a result of it.
Thanks, Munjal. And you and Ruth both just shared incredible visions for where this can go in the future. We've seen meteoric rise in LLMs, right? It's one of the fastest adoptions of technology we have ever seen. There are, sort of unconfirmed reports that OpenAI, who's the maker of ChatGPT, already has over $1 billion in revenue. Now that's unconfirmed, but consistent with the reports that we're hearing about the huge adoptions and the number of people who are signing up for paid subscriptions. And so my question is, clearly people are excited about this. There's incredible potential. How do we get there? Maybe we can just quickly go around and just everyone, what's an immediate thing we can do to help us realize this vision of LLMs in healthcare? Varun, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think there's been a Cambrian explosion in large language models over the last 5 or 6 years. And of course, with OpenAI capping it, I think one of the interesting things you'll find from large language model providers is all problems of large language models are addressed by other large language models. So you're like, well, GPT-3 is hard to explain. How does it work? They're like, well, GPT-4 explains GPT-3, and they'll publish a paper where GPT-4 explains what GPT-3 does. It's kind of amazing. The other thing you had was, yes, the first and foremost winners are always at the infrastructure level. NVIDIA just became $1 trillion company because of the demand for the core GPU unit and their next gen platform called Morpheus, I think codename Morpheus, I don't know off the record perhaps, that everyone wants access to train these large language models. And they just predicted that in the next 90 days, they had a forecast for certain revenue and they beat that by 60% at multi-billion-dollar scale. Once these infrastructure starts to get deployed, then people will have capacity to train a lot of these models. I think one of the things we are running into as a provider of these applications is, yes, we have partnerships with both Azure and OpenAI, but they don't have enough dedicated capacity for us to use that infrastructure. So everyone's in line ordering base infrastructure, and that might take a year or so for it to pan out, and what geopolitics has to play, because a lot of these plants are in Taiwan, and what that means for this revolution also is something that remains to be seen. But I think what all of us need to be on the lookout for is, what are the use cases? I think prioritization of use cases internally can happen very, very quickly. It's super important to identify the risk and safety associated with these use cases as well. What's the mundane and what's easier to evaluate large language models on, and starting there, and then gradually going into more sort of advanced use cases. That doesn't mean that you don't go into some of the more advanced use cases, but having a spectrum and a timeline. What do you think can be accomplished in a year, 3 years, 5 years? I think anything beyond 2 or 3 years is sort of a little bit ridiculous to look at given the pace of change that's happening in this industry.
Great, thanks so much, Varun. Munjal.
I predict that LLMs will become the killer app of value-based healthcare. So that's my prediction. That when you're at risk with patient populations, this is going to be one of the better uses of this technology, is your ability to manage large groups of folks, effectively giving them better outcomes at lower costs. And we have been striving to find answers to that. Most of the time, it's a zero-sum game. We move a bunch of resources to help this subgroup of patients, but then this subgroup kind of ends up doing worse. And I think for the first time, because of the spare capacity, it's not a zero-sum game. And so whether we like it or not, value-based continues to eat up more and more and more of the total healthcare pie. Right now, Medicare Advantage just crossed 51% of all seniors in Medicare Advantage, and while seniors are only 20% of the population, they're a vast majority of the consumption, right, and the number of appointments and operations and other procedures. And so we need a better solution, and I believe this thing is going to fundamentally change this whole value-based category for all the different folks in it.
Great, thank you. Ruth?
It typically takes 17 years to move a research result into practice. I don't want us to wait 17 years for Munjal's platform or Brian's note summary machine. I want research organizations, large research organizations, trial organizations that have access to a variety of practice settings to test these in vivo. What we learn isn't necessarily how well each of these algorithms function, but how a system needs to adapt itself in order to most efficiently implement it. Because once you've seen one healthcare system, you've seen one healthcare system. And what's going to influence the adoption of the note-taking summary is if the clinicians actually use it, and identification of the barriers of those types of things, and how then they use these summary notes to help inform the clinical care encounter. If I have to push through five buttons to get the note summary, I could just skim because I'm a really fast reader. Then I turn to the patient and explain. It has to reduce what we've been calling the time toxicity for everybody. And I am really, really excited to plan large implementation trials around some of these things which can really revolutionize how we deliver care.
Thank you.
We have a trust problem with AI. If you look at multiple surveys, Pew Research, CNN, Fox just published some within the past year, all of them show the majority of population in the US does not trust AI. Now that may not be the case here in this room, but the broader society, that's a fact. And so, to your question, like how do we realize some of these, profoundly transformational gains in things like LLM? I think we first need to address that trustworthy problem. And I think, how do we get there? It starts with, the kind of transparency that, frankly, I think those of us in industry in this space, we haven't done our job bringing that level of transparency to how we develop these things, how we train these things, how they're deployed. As a clinician, is the model that I'm about to use on this patient, is it fit for purpose? The EHR that I use doesn't have any way of telling me that right now. And so even clinicians can't fully understand in a transparent way how these models are trained and if they should be used on this patient. And so addressing that trustworthy problem by developing, this gets back exactly to what you're talking about, Varun, like how are we rewarding these models in their training methodology? And then I'm a big believer in this from an alignment and assurance perspective. If we as a society can come together with a shared set of very clear, transparently agreed upon and displayed set of metrics on how we measure the alignment or assurance for these large language models, that's what we need in a highly consequential space like health. And if a patient's life depends on it, we need it.
Thank you all. I just want to also add that we all need to work together, right? Even on this panel, we have a microcosm of the stakeholders needed. We have industry, large and early stage. We have academia, we have government. And it's all of us and all of us in this room that need to come together. This is new and early, and we really have an opportunity to shape this together, guided by some of the incredible principles that we just discussed. I want to thank you. We have a few minutes left and probably time for a couple of audience questions. I think there's going to be someone with mics, maybe? Okay, great. So we have a question in the front up here. And we're going to get you a mic in 1 second.
James Phillip, Harvard Medical School. How can we get people to enter the data into the system so that every time we have a healthcare encounter or any encounter in life, we understand what subpopulation that patient is in? Can we give them money to entice them? Are there charities? Is the government available to say $10 to fill out this form?
If you could come up with the answer, I'd like to hire you.
$10 to fill out the form.
Actually, a lot of people are not motivated by money. There are groups of patients who don't want to give you information because they fundamentally do not trust the system that's collecting the information. And I wouldn't necessarily blame them. So it's a challenge, but there are a lot of people actually working in this space to try to get folks to participate.
Great, thank you, Jim. I saw a few other hands. There's one in this corner over here. We'll just wait to get you a mic. Great, thank you.
Thank you. So you've all alluded to the institutional impediments to implementation. Is there an institutional structure to overcome those impediments? Or are we likely to wait 17 years? Thank you.
One of the teams that I'm working with use business design principles to take a particular practice, walk through the process relevant for a particular care delivery encounter. So for example, supportive care nursing. And they map out, they do maps of the practice, and they look at key decision makers. And many times a lot of the key decision makers are folks on the front line, so it has to work for them. At the same time, there has to be leadership buy-in, because oftentimes there are resources that need to be expended, both in the purchase of the AI algorithm, for example, but also the deployment and training of the frontline staff. One of the unanticipated issues that we've run into, particularly in the post-COVID era, has been the transitional nature of the workforce. So that when we train the workforce on a particular AI algorithm or on a particular care process, the person who's in charge then leaves and there's no institutional memory. So the challenges of implementation are multifactorial, but there are ways of addressing them.
I'll add a little bit more color to this. I think the things we're seeing with large healthcare organizations, pharmaceutical companies, is there's two concepts that come into play. One is AI is a disruptive force, so you need a senior level person who likely reports to a senior executive directly with a mandate of ensuring that AI use cases are being identified and the right ones that are suitable for deployment of AI applications are being prioritized and staffed, and decisions are being made fast in those lines. And the second one is this concept that is often used called steel threading. If you think about a steel rope, it's made of multiple threads of steel. So identify one use case that goes end to end and has many different sort of decision points in it, but you activate one entire use case end to end, and that gives you enough of an example of what it takes to deploy an AI use case in an organization in arguably a safe, mundane area, and then you can continue to build upon it with the next level of sort of use cases.
Necessity is the mother of invention. In the last 30 days, I've met with 30 health system CEOs who took meetings with a brand new startup that just came out, because they're in pain right now with their staffing costs. Their nursing costs went up 30% in the pandemic. Their revenue went up on average 8%. And they're all, a bunch of the health systems that don't have huge endowments are really struggling. And so they are open to new ideas in a way they maybe weren't open before. And so I think you're seeing just a groundswell of interest occurring because of just the financial situation, unfortunately, that folks are in. And sometimes that is what drives the next wave of adoption, the next wave of innovation, and so maybe you won't have to wait so long.
A couple thoughts for academic medical centers, I think. So if you haven't read NIST's risk management framework, I definitely encourage folks to take a look at the RMF. The basic idea is from low risk to high risk, there are different steps you can take. Starting with the low risk rung of the ladder, it's easier to innovate in that space, to disseminate learnings and knowledge and large language model applications. And so I would definitely encourage folks to, in a research-driven environment, not clinical decision-making, to deploy AI technology in those lower risk, and then slowly climb up that ladder for LLM use cases into the higher risk category. And I think starting with that as the basic kind of institutional framework to your question about how do we get innovation deployed faster, I think we'd see a lot of fruit being born quickly.